What is going on, everybody? It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS preview for week 4 of the NFL season. Going to break down, go game by game, break down some of my favorite plays, talk through ownership, some of the chalk, a few strategy notes when going through the games, and then, of course, all of your live questions. It's Friday. Hopefully, everybody is having a great start to their weekend. Our Thursday night football stream was an absolute fire, just a banger if I've ever seen one. We ended up going out there, almost shipping the GPP ourselves. Had plenty of guys in the Discord and community. I got plenty of YouTube comments of people that went out there and nearly shipped the tournaments themselves. So you love to see that. It seemed like it was a pretty solid community day. And let's ride that momentum into the weekend now. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. We'll go ahead and get this started with a little look at the injury report. So over here on Underdog, their Twitter page, which, by the way, is a really good way to get a lot of the NFL injury news put into one place. They're following a lot of the beat reporters, sending all of that out. A few people that are questionable. So to this point, we don't know their status. Christian McCaffrey with the Panthers, Alvin Kamara, who has seemingly had an injury designation for the entire year at this point. Marquise Brown is questionable for the Cardinals. He did play last week, had over 10 catches. He's also been banged up quite a bit of the year, so not a surprise to see those three names at the top, particularly CMC. That guy just gets hurt perennially, pretty much every other week. But hey, he should be able to go. I do expect him to be able to play. Cordarrelle Patterson's a game time decision. Same thing with Chris Godwin, who's returning from injury, has been out for a few weeks at this point. Dalton Schultz sat out last week, is also questionable. We're unsure of his status heading into the weekend. Also on the Cardinals, you have Rondale Moore. So not only Marquise Brown, but Rondale Moore in that offense are questionable. Zach Ertz still isn't 100%. So players like a Greg Dortch, even a few of the other perimeter players like an AJ Green, he's able to play this week, which I think AJ Green might be out as well. They're really, really banged up in that Cardinals offense. Pretty much every single player at the wide receiver position has an injury designation. So that's definitely an offense that we might be able to get to some value. You have Jameis Winston doubtful. Now that's the one piece of news that we can pretty much count on there. They're going to go with Andy Dalton. And Andy Dalton, the Red Rocket, is far from who you want commanding an offense. And he's arguably going to be a lot more productive than Jameis with a broken back. I mean, he looked fatigued out there. He couldn't move it downfield. It really looks like he had a hard time using his back foot as any sort of leverage. It looked like he was kind of just using all arm motion out there with his throwing and was throwing ducks. You saw that with the production, and they really, really struggled as an offense. So I actually think that's going to be an upgrade to that offense. You have Andy Dalton, who's also going to be relatively cheap this week. And but I don't think going to a Saints stack is going to be something that I really like getting to. We'll at least talk about some of the other options on the team. A few other injury situations that are figured out. So Hunter Renfrow is out. Christian Watson for the Packers will be playing. You have Jair Alexander for the Packers, who's going to be questionable, so he'll be a game time decision. That's important for anybody matching up against him. In terms of the Chargers, Justin Herbert was cleared. He's going to be good to go. Keenan Allen is listed out, so he's not going to be playing. DeAndre Swift is out. We saw that earlier on this afternoon. Also, Jacoby Myers is a game time decision for the Patriots. So we're going to talk about these all again when we go game by game, but you're going to have Brandon Hoyer starting for that team. So a little throwback there. I mean, the guy's in his 40s at this point. He'll be commanding the Patriots offense. We talked about Dalton Schultz. Michael Gallup should be back. So that is worth noting. So without Dalton Schultz, that could leave a little bit of production out there, but Michael Gallup will be there to suck some of it up. Minkah Fitzpatrick's back for the Steelers, which I'd love to see as a Steeler fan out there, of course. And Wan'Dale Robinson, piece of value for the Giants, won't be there. Same thing for Kadarius Toney. So they're going to be throwing a lot more to people like Richie James Jr., who, when we get to that Giants game later on, he's going to be one of the chalkiest players on the slate. As of right now, is right around like 15 to 17% projected owned. Could very well be closer to 20 to 25% come Sunday. So a lot of that is because of the injury situation, right? Just less targets to go around to that team, a little bit more concentrated without those pass catchers, much like what we saw there in a primetime game. Outside of that, Dawson Knox is also a game time decision. That'll be important to see with the chalky Bills offense. They're going up against the Baltimore Ravens. So when we get to that game, there's going to be quite a few guys that are high owned. I mean, Mark Andrews, your highest owned quarterback, and Josh Allen. Stephon Diggs, I believe, is the only wide receiver projecting for over 20% ownership right now. A lot of pieces of chalk to talk about there. And if Dawson Knox is out, that's only going to make them even more popular. Yeah, AJ Green's out. I figured that was the case. I thought so. I thought he was at the very least doubtful. So it's not just Rondale Moore. It's not just a few of the other pieces there that are injured. I mean, even James Conner to this point isn't running at 100%. He's going to play, right? He doesn't have an injury designation, but he's still a little bit banged up. Pretty much everyone on that team is dealing with issues. Gabe Davis will be playing for the Bills, so that kind of takes away from some of Stephon Diggs' production. And geez, there's so many injuries at this point, right? It's only week 4. So when we get to week 7 and 8, I mean, we might be doing this for legitimately like half an hour to an hour talking about these injuries. It's quite extensive here, only just a month into the season. Dalvin Cook is good to go. We already talked about Gabe Davis, and we're starting to get to some of the repeats here. Amon-Ra St. Brown, that was out this morning. He's not going to be playing this week. And Taysom Hill might be getting a lot of usage in that Saints offense. So, I gave the Red Rocket the job there at quarterback, but even if he quote unquote is the starting quarterback, you're going to have plenty of sets where Taysom Hill is the quarterback, running, obviously a rushing first type of offense. They've been really productive doing so in the past. And he can still throw too. So you probably see quite a bit of Taysom Hill this week. If indeed Jameis Winston ends up getting rolled out. Let's hop into the first game now. So that was quite a bit. Obviously, just wanted to touch on everything in general. But now let's go ahead and focus on it, right? Talk about some of the implications of a few of these injuries and potential stacks from the GPP perspective that we might see ourselves getting to. So the first game is between Cleveland and Atlanta. You have, I'd say, an average total right around like that 45 to 47 point mark. The spread is close, and that's actually getting this game a little bit more attention than I think it deserves, where you have a -1 spread. Excuse me, guys. A lot of gas building up right now. I'm favoring the Browns there. Atlanta has been very impressive to this point. I mean, going into the year, the spread for this game would have been something closer to like 4 to 7 points, even on the road favoring the Browns there. But Atlanta, again, has been a lot better I shouldn't say a lot better. It's just horrible phrasing right there. They've been a lot more efficient on offense than a lot of people wanted to give them credit for, including myself. Marcus Mariota clearly is still accurate with the throwing, right? They handcuffed him a while ago when it came to his rushing ability. Over there in Tennessee, they never really let him go out there and use his legs and never really put himself in any sort of danger out there. I think it was to prolong his career. So I'm sure when he's 40, 50 years old, he's going to be really thankful that he made that decision. But from a fantasy perspective, he's not bringing us all that much rushing upside. So, if you look at this, he's not, at least if you look at the game log over here for Marcus Mariota, you'll get an idea, right? The rushing production to this point, there's been a few touchdowns, right? So last week he did score a rushing touchdown, which was great to see. It was a 6-yard touchdown, so it wasn't anything crazy. He did score there in week 1, but ever since week 1 where he went out there and rushed for 72 yards, it's been 16 yards, it's been 4 yards. He's been getting it done decently through the air where he's been, his ADOT is right around 10 yards at this point, which is a lot higher than what we saw for him over there in Tennessee. So he is moving the ball down the field a little bit more than what we have historically seen from Mariota, but I think it's just being overowned. Like when I look at the ownership right now, which by the way, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. We're going to do it for quarterback. I'm going to share my screen, show you guys my quarterback projections, just to give you an idea of what I'm referencing behind the veil here. If you're looking for access to all of these for every position over here, obviously I have the tab for running back, wide receiver, and tight end. It is all on my Patreon page. But you can see Marcus Mariota, right? 8.6% owned down here at $5,600. That's nearly 4 times as owned as a Trevor Lawrence. That's more than 4 times as owned as a Matt Ryan, more than twice as owned as Jacoby Brissett on the other side. He's no longer that low-owned pivot play that you can get to, right? That has that upside. He is now the chalk on the slate. So you have to make that sort of decision. And for me, anytime you have a low-quality player like Marcus Mariota, and it's no diss to him, right? I think he's a great guy. I think that he's an upstanding player, a great leader of a team, but he's not some fantasy stud that I'm playing in 25% of my lineups next week and feeling comfortable about. Now, if he was 5-6% owned and I was taking him in 15% to try and get some leverage to the field, and he was bringing me that sort of utility, then maybe I would consider it. But, you're starting to get to the point at 8.6%. It might come in closer to 10% by the time we get to lock on Sunday, that he might be your highest owned quarterback, right? So if we go up here, just to give you an idea, Jalen Hurts, I have projected owned in 10.3% of lineups. Josh Allen owned in 11.3%. So they're slightly edging out of Marcus Mariota, but it's not by much, right? It's like a 2 to 3% edge in both cases. Yeah, I'd much rather take the stud options. And sure, they cost more, right? But if I'm investing 25% of my lineups into stacks of the offense, right? Because you have to remember, it's not just stacking Mariota in his rushing upside. Even if you're playing Mariota, who has a little bit of that rushing upside, you're still going to pair him up with at least one wide receiver, if not two, like many people do in their traditional stacks. And that whole offense in general, I mean, I guess outside of Kyle Pitts, who I absolutely love this week, is a little bit of a dumpster fire. So just wanted to show you guys some of these quarterback projections. You can see that Geno Smith also getting quite a bit of ownership down there. These are early in the week. They will change, right? So if you're on the Patreon, you'll be able to get the live ownership throughout. Even Mitchell Trubisky down here, 5.3%, Baker, 4.4%, Cooper Rush, 2.3%. These are all guys that I'd rather take a shot on than take a chalky Marcus Mariota, right? And a lot of that is just driven by the fact that it's a close game script, right? So I'll go ahead and bring up the ESPN over here again. It's all because of the spread, right? It's a 1-point spread, and everyone goes, oh, it's going to be a close competitive game. Sure, the spread's 1 point. That doesn't mean the outcome is going to be a 1-point outcome, right? It could still be a blowout for one side or the other. The only reason that it's a -1 spread, and people forget this, right? Vegas projects not only for outcome, but also for action, right? They have to set certain props at numbers where they know they're going to get even action, right, in terms of money on each side. Because when they're able to get a 50-50 split, in case you didn't know this, right, some people don't know this, so I'm going to explain it. Sorry if it's a little bit elementary for some of you, but they have to get a 50-50 split ideally on all their props, because then the in-house edge automatically wins, right? So, if they have even action or expected payout from each side, that's actually how they do it, right? It's not money put in, it's expected payout. They want it to be equal for each side of the prop, for each side of the bet, so on and so forth for a lot of these sports books. Then their in-house edge, right, where the -110 or the -115 juice that you have to lay to, put those bets down, automatically wins the money in the long term, right? So these numbers over here, -1 spread and whatnot, it's not always indicative of what they think the score is going to be, but rather what they think is going to make people bet to an even expected payout outcome. That's literally how they set lines. So just, if anyone didn't know that out there, right, I just wanted to make that apparent, because it's not always the end all be all when it comes to this. And in fact, I'd argue that a lopsided victory for the Browns is a lot more likely than them winning by like 3 points here, right? If they get a commanding lead, win by, get a 7 to 14 point lead, you're looking at them just running out the clock. They're going to be able to control the ball. And sure, they lit up a huge lead against the Jets. That is the extreme outlier, given how strong their offense is, how, they have two running backs capable of holding the load, an offensive line that's probably the best in the entire NFL. They're more equipped to, close out games than pretty much anybody else. On the flip side, if they're not running very efficient on offense and they're playing from behind, they are not equipped to go out there and play from behind, right? Jacoby Brissett doesn't have the arm you're looking for. They don't have nearly enough talent at wide receiver to go out there and run a track meet, score 3 or 4 touchdowns in the second half. So I don't see this being a close game. Like, in terms of like how I'd project it, almost all of the close game outcomes would be fringe outcomes for me, right? So this -1 spread, like, I guess from like 1,000 simulations, if you were to average the scores, they'd probably be close to a -1 or a +1 spread. But in terms of the actual percentage of outcomes that are close to the median, I don't think it's going to be a very high percentage. Hopefully that's making sense to y'all. I know it's a little bit technical what I was saying there, but overall, I just don't think that this is going to be nearly the game environment that a lot of other people expect it to be, and just probably going to be a fade for me. Both offenses are lackluster, right? It's a Jacoby Brissett-led offense versus a Marcus Mariota-led offense. And I think this over-under down here at 47 might be a little bit of fool's gold. Moving on to the next game, I'm not even really going to talk about. I'll bring up the Draftkings board, right? So I do like Kyle Pitts because he's still way too cheap. $5,000 for what he brings to the table is probably at least $1,500 too cheap, if not like $2,000 too cheap. Guys like him, Travis Kelce, and Mark Andrews have a ceiling that's maybe a solid 10 to 15 points higher than anybody else at tight end. And at $5,000, I mean, just to bring up the tight end position in general here, right? To give you an idea, let's get the Browns off the board there, right? Andrews is $7,100, right? Waller is $5,600. I'd also argue that he's pretty close to that tier. So maybe it's four of them up there at the top that have that sort of ceiling. But Waller, Pitts, these sort of players have a solid 5 to 10 point higher ceiling than, a Nertz, a Goddard, a Freiermuth, a TJ Hawkinson, for example, because they can get you a 7 to 8 catch game for over 100 yards. Not only go out there, get you, like 70 yards and a touchdown, maybe score 2 touchdowns. That's a lot of these sort of players' way to get to a ceiling performance. They're not really going to post you 30, 35 points, maybe once a year if they get lucky. Whereas a Kyle Pitts with his sort of yards after catch ability, he's also extremely athletic. A Darren Waller, Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, they can go out there and get you 30 plus points, probably at least 3-4 times a year, right? And when we're playing DFS for a main slate for the first 16 weeks, 17 weeks, if you're playing out there, actually this is 18 this year, it's pretty sweet. 18 weeks here. You're towards the end, right? It's going to start to get a little bit more random, but hey, if you're, getting 4 or 5 of those outcomes a year, a quarter of the time, right? One of these guys is going to go off and get you that sort of performance. So I love putting them in my player pool. They'll have a low floor, right? Like, so if Kyle Pitts gets shut down, right, he could post you 3-4 fantasy points, but he does just have a much higher ceiling than a lot of his peers, right? So $5,000, I think it makes quite a bit of sense. Outside of that, I don't love a lot of players here. Drake London is a little bit more expensive now. He's gotten a ton of targets over his first 3 games, so it's deserving. It's a 7, 12, and then 6 targets last week. He was really efficient with his targets, was able to get the 12 fantasy points on just 6 targets. So you'll love to see that from Drake London, but probably, appropriately priced at this point. He's no longer a super cheap pick. In terms of running backs, I don't really love either side. I also want to put up Cleveland here. If you're going to take anybody, I would take Kareem Hunt, who's being a little bit overlooked. A few weeks ago, I believe Chubb was $6,600, and I believe Kareem Hunt was $6,200. So there was only a $400 gap between the two players, and now it's $1,900. Kareem Hunt, if you remember in week 1, the reason why he was more expensive is he scored 23 fantasy points, right? He scored a receiving touchdown and a rushing touchdown, had 11 attempts, also 4 targets out of the backfield. He's going to get you games like that, particularly when they're playing from ahead. So if he's going to be the super overlooked of the two there and also the lower owned, I don't love this game in general, but, Kyle Pitts from Atlanta, somebody like a Kareem Hunt from the Browns side, I think make a little bit of sense. So I'm going to pick my spots and choose them wisely in terms of that game. A little bit more exciting here. Let's go on to the Buffalo at the Ravens game, which is going to be extremely chalky. You have a lot of people getting to Josh Allen stacks. Stephon Diggs is the highest owned, in terms of projected ownership, owned player at wide receiver on the entire slate. And then on the flip side, you have Lamar Jackson, who's not low owned, right? But he's right there at the average in terms of ownership. The guys like Mark Andrews that are getting a lot of attention, just pieces of chalk that we probably need to touch on here. We will remember that Gabe Davis should play. We know that Stephon Diggs is good. The real question mark is Dawson Knox, who we don't have an injury report on. On the Baltimore side, they're extremely healthy. At this point, J.K. Dobbins is back. He didn't get all the touches we'd expect from him last week, but I would expect him to get more and more incorporated into the offense over the next game or so. So I don't love him because he's probably right where he should be in terms of price at $5,300. If he goes out there and he's efficient with what I expect to be like 15 to 18 touches, he could get you to the ceiling performance, but I'm going to prefer him in the future when I'm projecting him for closer to the 22 to 25 touch range. And he's going to project for closer to like 14 to 15 fantasy points. It's closer to like 11 to 12 fantasy points, which isn't horrible at $5,300. But I think if he goes out there and he has another like 8 to 10 point game, we're probably going to get him at like $5,500 at the very most for week 5. And that might be when he goes out there and breaks off, scores like 20 to 30 fantasy points. I probably want to wait until next time out. So I'm going to wait on J.K. Dobbins. Hopefully he doesn't have that nuclear performance now because he will be low owned. He's only $5,300. I just think that with the injury concerns that we have, that it might be a little bit too early to get to him. A lot of chalk going behind Mark Andrews, who is also expensive. So even at that price tag, let me check out his ownership. So I have it over on the other tab here. Again, if you're looking for direct access, it's on the Patreon, but he's 13.9% owned, which is, let's see, nearly 4.5 times higher owned than a Darren Waller. It's much higher than a Kyle Pitts. It's almost 4 times higher owned than a Zach Ertz. You're not only paying up in terms of price, you're also paying a premium in terms of ownership. So I don't love this game. Just, you guys know me. I hate chalk, right? I hate going out there, getting myself involved with 15 to 20% of the field on any one player. So for me, the Josh Allen stacks, as much as it makes sense, right? The game environment is conducive for a high scoring game, right? 51 points. Lamar Jackson has been electric in terms of his production, right? Posting 40-point games seemingly every single week. Josh Allen has posted a 30-point game literally every single week. I don't know. It just feels too good to be true. Like, legitimately, that's what I'm thinking at the back of my mind, is that it's just too good to be true, right? These teams are going to run into a stone wall at some point. And the Bills, they have, I would say, an underrated defense, if it even can be underrated, being a top 5 unit in the NFL. And on the flip side, Baltimore, they're not going to be a top 5 defense in terms of points allowed because they run so many plays on offense, but they have plenty of playmakers out there, particularly in the secondary with a Marcus Peters. Who else? Not Lattimore. Marlon Humphrey would be the other cornerback that they have out there. A lot of really talented players. Marcus Peters they have out there too, right? Just a lot of studs in the secondary. Also, a few guys on the D line that are nasty players. I just have to say that as a Steeler fan, right? Got to put respect where it's deserved out there. It could be a defensive affair, could be, right? And now, more than likely, both teams are going to be productive there, but we have an entire slate to work with, right? We have plenty of other games to break down. There's a few other high total games that we can get to. A lot of the ownership is going to center around a few of the teams here. So we know about that game as being chalked. Just to give you an idea of a few others, this Denver versus the Raiders game, I think might get a little bit of attention. The Arizona versus the Panthers, I think they're going to get quite a bit of attention. And back towards the latter half, I mean, that's really it. And then everyone's going to play this game, right? This Bills versus Ravens game. So as of right now, just to remind you, my ownership on Josh Allen's 11.3%. It's only 5.3% on a Lamar Jackson. I think it's going to come in higher. I think as we get closer to lock, you're going to see even more people getting to it and whatnot. Just, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to be a part of this mega chalk game that just seems like it's by far the best game on the slate. And call me foolish, right? In cash, don't get me wrong. This is the game to get to in terms of cash, right? Josh Allen stacks. You can even play Lamar Jackson naked when it comes to your cash lineup. Play Stephon Diggs naked. Just go with some of that sort of correlation. You want to get exposure to it in cash, but in large field GPPs, it's just going to be I expect it to be super high owned, right? Like even the numbers I'm looking at right now, I think are going to be low. So that's what I have to say about that. What's going on, Dave? Hopefully you're doing well down there. CJ says, unrelated comment, Justin Suh is trash. Yeah, I'm kind of glad he is. I didn't play him this week, so I'm pretty happy about that. Let's see. I got to check on my good old boy, Taylor Moore. He parred the last hole. You love to see that. He has a bogey-free round. Sorry, this isn't a golf stream, but that really helps me out with Showdown. I actually cashed all 150 of my Showdown lineups today. That hasn't happened, I believe, ever for me on a Showdown slate where I've had 150 lineups and they've all cashed. But we did it today. That's pretty solid. So thank you for reminding me about golf. I had to check that out myself. And to this point, I think I have right around 23% 6 of 6. The field average is 6.5%. So I'm looking pretty good for the golf side too, for anybody out there that indulges in that. Let's move on to the next game. So we talked enough about this Bills-Ravens game, which again, it's going to be chalky. It makes a lot of sense. But from the GPP perspective, from a game theory perspective, I think you'd be doing yourself a disservice to play it. Let's talk about the Commanders and the Cowboys, an ugly game, if I've ever seen one. But sometimes these ugly games are where you can find spots of a little bit of promise, right? So maybe not a stack. Cooper Rush stack might be a little bit out there, though he does bring a little bit of rushing upside to the table. It's not impossible for a Cooper Rush stack to get there. A Carson Wentz stack, everyone was on that after the first week, right? He looked like a world killer out there in week 1. But yeah, they both came back down to earth. Right, we're in a 41.5 point total game, a 3-point spread actually favoring the Cowboys, which I guess makes sense. But you're talking about two extremely low momentum teams. I don't want to call them low quality teams because they both very could well be playoff contenders, get into the playoffs and actually make a little bit of noise there. But as of right now, they're running with low momentum. So I don't think a lot of people are going to get there. There's not a ton of injury news outside of Dalton Schultz to speak of. So we'll keep an eye on that. He's a game time decision as of right now. If he ends up playing, obviously, I would consider him for DFS because let's look at this game. A little bit of underpriced nature for the slate, but also going to be way lower owned. So first off, Dalton Schultz, $3,900. you're not going to find him priced lower than that the entire year. So if he plays, definitely like getting to Dalton Schultz. In terms of wide receivers, Michael Gallup is back. He's only $5,100 based on the role that we expect him to have without Amari Cooper in the offense. That's probably way cheaper than we'll see him for the rest of the year. So definitely agree that he's a solid value this week. He doesn't have an injury designation, so he's 100%. In terms of running backs, Antonio Gibson, $6,000. I mean, that's okay. I don't love the play. The Dallas running backs, at least from a large field GPP perspective, are kind of hard to take because they do cannibalize each other's production so much. With the quarterbacks, like I mentioned, they can be an optimal, but I don't expect them to get there. So I'm not going to stack this game, but guys like Dalton Schultz that are way too cheap there. We talked about Michael Gallup also being a little bit too cheap. Even on the other side of things, Terry McLaurin at $6,500. I mean, he's truly like a $7,000 wide receiver. He's one of those elite tier options. He's going to usually get you closer to 8 or 9 targets rather than the only 4 targets that he had in week 1. He did convert one of those into a 49-yard touchdown in week 1. So he was still kind of able to get there in terms of the fantasy point production. But he's going to post a lot more PPR production than what we've seen to this point. And he's always capable of scoring you that 49-yard touchdown, right? I mean, look at this, 49 yards, 35 yards is long, 45 yards is long there in week 3. He's constantly getting you a lot more yardage after the catch, one of the yak leaders in terms of the entire NFL. And yeah, I think if you're going to get to anybody in this game, right, you try and take some of the lower priced, lower owned players that are just not getting attention because a lot of people aren't forcing them into their lineups because of stacks, right? When you're using an optimizer, a lot of your fringe exposure. So fringe exposure would be like not guys that are like core plays for you that in terms of points per dollar, right, are at the top of your list that the optimizer is going to try and jam into as many lineups as humanly possible. The guys that are more fringe options that, you may actually have to try and force into lineups yourself. It's not going to get you if you're using an optimizer to many lineups with a Terry McLaurin. It's not going to get you to much Dalton Schultz, even at that price tag if he plays, just because of some of the injury concerns. So if you go into your optimizer, into your process, and maybe just bump up their projections a little bit, take them in, 15 to 20% of your lineups, and they go out there and it gets you a ceiling, you might have that guy who scores you 20 to 25 fantasy points. It is 1 to 2% owned. And is also a solid $1,000 less expensive than he probably should be. So I like getting to some of the single one-off players here in this Washington versus Dallas game. But again, you're talking about a low total game, 2 offenses that are led by quarterbacks that are, I'm just going to call them low momentum, right? I don't want to talk shit about anyone's quarterback out there. Just not very high ceiling quarterbacks. Let's just say that, right? They're not going to go out there, get you 450 yards, 4 touchdowns. But for single one-off plays here, there's more than enough production to go around to get somebody to their ceiling. Let's move on to the next game, which is Seattle and Detroit. This is I'd say a little bit of a sneaky game. I mean, this Detroit offense was the sweetheart coming in. A lot of that because of the Hard Knocks show. People love playing the fantasy players from that team after getting to know them better in the offseason, but they've also been extremely productive. And you can see the total here is a 48-point total game. Now, if we look at ownership, so we brought it up a little bit earlier. If you remember, Geno Smith was 6.9% projected owned, which is a little bit higher than I expected. Definitely getting a little bit of ownership there that, it's a little bit higher than everyone else, right? It's 3 times higher than a Cooper Rush. It's 4 times higher than a Justin Fields. It's nearly twice as much as Baker Mayfield. It's higher than Daniel Jones, believe it or not, who obviously brings a lot of rushing upside to the table. So he's not being extremely low owned. But if you go to Jared Goff, he's $5,900, so he's a little bit more expensive, and he's also the player that I project for a lot more points here. He's only 5% owned, right? So he's lower owned than Geno Smith. So it seems like a lot of the chalk here is getting to the Seattle side, whereas I think all of the upside here, particularly because they're more of a passing offense, is with the Lions, especially with DeAndre Swift out. With Swift out, they're not going to be forcing Jamal Williams to get the ball 20 to 25 times. While he's capable of being a power running back, and if they're playing from way ahead, I could see him getting a lot of rushing attempts, like closer to 20 to 25. In a neutral game script, they're going to be passing a lot more, right? And Jared Goff could get you to 3 touchdowns, maybe 4 touchdowns in a ceiling sort of performance. I prefer that side of the equation there, particularly if he's going to be lower owned than somebody like a Geno Smith. So 48-point total, I think it's not super sneaky because, right, it's still getting a little bit of ownership in terms of your quarterback and some of the stacks that you're getting to. But I do think that it's well warranted and a game that it will be getting to, right? Because it's not 12 to 15% at quarterback like what you have over there for Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills. It's a little bit more respectable. You can take them in 12 to 15% of your lineups. And by they, I mean Geno Smith or Jared Goff. Again, I prefer Goff out of this game, but you could take either quarterback in 12 to 15% of your lineups and get adequate leverage to the field. Whereas, with Josh Allen, you got to play him in 25 to 30%. It's a much larger investment into your player pool. So particularly if you're playing 150 lineups, right? That's a sizable portion of your lineups invested into one offense of one player specifically. But let's talk about a few of the actual options in this game that I like outside of just, liking Jared Goff and a few of the stacks. At wide receiver, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown out. Jameson Williams isn't expected to come back yet. Also, you have DJ Chark questionable. So, a lot of pass catchers are questionable. So that kind of leads me to TJ Hawkinson because a lot of people's first reaction is going to be to go, oh, Josh Reynolds. Oh, let's try to get to Khalif Raymond or Quintez Cephas down there at $3,000. Yeah, Quintez Cephas. Been a while since we've had to use him in DFS, right? But yeah, he's still over there on Detroit, down there at like the number 5 in terms of their wide receiver chart. But hey, if they have all these guys out, he could be out there as your number 2 wide receiver. And Cephas has actually been pretty damn decent in the past. If you remember, he's a deep play threat waiting to happen. So I don't hate him at $3,000, but at tight end, Hawkinson at $4,100, who's also way, way too cheap for what he brings to the table, could be that sneaky pick there to try and take with a Jared Goff. So it's cheap. If you take the stack, go with a Jared Goff, let's say, DJ Chark, if he plays, and then TJ Hawkinson, you're going to be able to take premium running backs, maybe one of the top end premium wide receivers you're on the slate. And that makes it especially attractive to me. On the other side, I still like Rashad Penny. He was my number 1 value running back last week who didn't pan out nearly as well as I was hoping for. Dameon Pierce outscored him, who I played in bunches. And I also had Ramondre Stevenson, who I played in bunches too. So I played those 3 value running backs, but I'm still willing to get there with Rashad Penny because he's extremely efficient. I mean, look at this. Look at his game log here, right? 14 carries for 66 yards. That's solid. 12 carries for 60. Didn't get a bunch of touches for week 2, but in general, if you look at his game logs over the last few years, it was averaging 4.5 to 6 yards a carry pretty regularly, which for a starting running back is extremely, I mean, it's above average. It's more than solid enough. And in this offense, if they can play from ahead, maybe rather than taking a chalky Geno Smith, maybe we take a Rashad Penny, right? So if I look at his ownership to give you an idea, right, he's at $4,900. I have Rashad Penny being owned 9.8% of the time, which might seem really high, right? Especially when you compare him to Geno Smith at 6.9%. But you have to remember that you can play multiple running backs in your lineup. You can also play a running back at the flex position. You only have one spot to put Geno Smith in it, right? So you have to at least double the ownership of Geno Smith to get an idea of what he would be at running back. And that's closer to 13.5, probably 14 or 15%. We consider the usage there in the flex spot. So, the 9.8% on Rashad Penny, I'm willing to play him in like 20 to 25% of my lineups. Again, because you have multiple slots to play running back at, as opposed to a quarterback where you have that single slot. Moving on to the next game, the Chargers at the Houston Texans. We do have Justin Herbert back, which is great. I mean, he played last week, but didn't really look like his normal self out there. I can't believe they left him out there to dry throughout the entire game. But a 45-point total, Houston defense has not been a joke to this point, but they still have lit up plenty of fantasy production. The spread's 5.5 points. I think it might be a little bit light there. Should be a little bit closer to 7 in my personal opinion. But from the fantasy perspective, Keenan Allen out. That's going to open up plenty of production for Mike Williams. Guys like Joshua Palmer, even, of course, a few of the tight ends for the Chargers might get a few extra looks. Donald Parham Jr. is a game-time decision. And then for the Texans, a few tight ends that one of them are out, right? Brevin Jordan. One of them is questionable with Pharaoh Brown. Just mostly have to worry about Keenan Allen here, right? And we head over to the player pool, look through some of the implications. You'll see that Mike Williams is priced up, right? He's been really good in the absence of Keenan Allen, right? Posted the 28-point performance in primetime against the Kansas City Chiefs. Only put up 8.5 points last week, but nobody did anything with Justin Herbert out there hurting the way that he was. But now that he's been taken off of the injury report, we know that he's going to play. I would expect that he's back to at least like 90, maybe 95% potential, which without Keenan Allen means that Mike Williams is going to get a ton of volume in this game, particularly as the favorites, a team that I expect to win this game. I think that Mike Williams at $7,000 is sure a little bit expensive, but I do think it's worth it. Joshua Palmer is a solid piece of value. You can go to Gerald Everett at tight end too. And if Donald Parham Jr. plays at $2,500, I think he could do crazier things. They love playing these tight ends out there. Trey McKitty has actually played plenty of snaps over the first 3 weeks. Those are all going to start to go to Donald Parham Jr. once he comes back from injury, and he's a much more productive player than McKitty. I mean, Donald Parham Jr., massive target in the red zone. He's going to get plenty of looks from Justin Herbert when he returns back to action. On the flip side, if you're looking for a buyback, there's not a ton to speak of, but Dameon Pierce, right? He's going to get more and more usage in this offense as the year goes on. You can see he went from 11 attempts to 15 to now 20 attempts. He might not get 25 next week, right? But that's the point that he's that's the direction that he's trending in at this point. In terms of the wide receiver targets, he's not getting a bunch, right? Just one in the first 2 games. He did get 2 targets there in week 3. But if he's getting 20 attempts a game, if he's getting the ball in his hands 20 to 25 times a game, like I was mentioning a little bit earlier, that's what you're looking for in a running back position, particularly one that's cheap at $5,600. So I don't hate him as a buyback. Brandon Cooks is a perennial option for the Houston Texans as a buyback. He's $5,800, pretty much always going to be in this $5,500 to $6,000 price range, and always an okay option, right? He posted 15 points in week 1. That's kind of what we're looking for. The 9 last week on 10 targets, the 7 targets where he only got 4 points isn't really what we're looking for, but he still has that ceiling in him. And those are the sort of guys I'd be looking for in terms of a buyback. Let's go on to the Texans at the Houston Texans. Wow. It's the wrong team there. It's the Tennessee Titans. I was looking at the wrong game, reading the wrong names there at the Indianapolis Colts. So let's bring that up, talk through some of the injuries, which there's not a ton in this game. You have Kyle Phillips, who's questionable. For the Colts side, there's not many fantasy relevant injuries. I mean, you do have Cody Hollister, who's like the 5th string wide receiver for the Titans, who's questionable for this game. So we can just focus on a lot of the big name guys, right? Like Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, right? You have 2 of the best running backs in the NFL going at each other. Unfortunately, if both offenses are running at full speed, there's not going to be many plays to be had in this game. You're going to see a lot of the clock run off with just first down after first down, the ball staying in play, the clock running in between plays. So this 43-point over-under, I would be slamming the under here. I mean, just anytime you have 2 rushing first offenses going against each other, you're typically going to see a lower scoring game. A lot of that due to the clock running off, right? Fewer plays being run. It's a low spread. You have a 3.5-point spread for the Colts, which you'd have to agree with too, based on what we've seen over the first few weeks. And you have overpriced running backs, right? $8,800, $8,300 for Derrick Henry, who sure, he had a solid week there, 25 points in week 3, but that was the best week that he's had to this point of the year, right? He hasn't had a good performance until week 3. Now he's $8,300. And even though Jonathan Taylor has been disappointing outside of week 1, he's still up there in price, right? He's only $200 less expensive than last week, only $300 less expensive than what we had him there in week 1. So I'm going to stay away. I think it's going to be a low total game, just 2 teams that are running it into each other. And again, when we want to target a game environment for fantasy purposes, it's when this is going to be a shootout, right? When both teams are running at full efficiency, we want them to be out there scoring, let's say 30 to 35 points, right? Go out there, get close to a 70-point total in terms of the total score. That's not going to happen here. If they're running at full efficiency, you're going to see probably like a, 21 to 28 point game at most for each team, if not closer to like a 21 to 14 point game. That's what I'm seeing here. So it's going to be a stay away for the most part. I mean, even at quarterback, I don't love getting to a Matt Ryan or Ryan Tannehill stack. The wide receivers, I'm okay with as one-offs, particularly guys like a Michael Pittman Jr., given he's a little bit expensive, but he's just seen so many targets to this point. He saw 9 targets last week. In week 1, he had 13 targets. Obviously didn't play in week 2 due to injury, but returned last week, got all the targets we were expecting. He didn't even score a touchdown. When he goes out there and he's able to post that touchdown production, he's going to post you 20 to 25 point weeks pretty much regularly. So if you're going to get to anybody, it's a one-off like a Michael Pittman that I like. But the running backs, I think, are a little bit overpriced, also probably a little bit overowned. So it's going to be a spot that I'm mostly staying away from. Let's go to the next game now. We've got like 6 games left. I'm going to try and do this in the next 20 minutes, if humanly possible. Let's go through the Bears and Giants next, bring them up over here on the ESPN tab. And at the end, we'll be talking about some of the prize picks props too. So stay tuned for that. We'll be talking through some of my top props here for the weekend. Let's talk through the Bears and the Giants. Another relatively low total game. In fact, it's in the 30s, right? 39.5-point total. 3-point spread favoring the New York Giants. A few injuries to speak on here. I mean, none that are really that fantasy relevant. I mean, Kadarius Toney hasn't seen that much action this year. Wan'Dale Robinson hasn't been active since week 1. So it's going to be the Richie James Jr. show like we've seen to this point. You have Sterling Shepard out for the year, right? So we know that. So there is production to go around, but we know who it's going to go to, right? Richie James Jr. is going to get a ton of targets out there. Even Darius Slayton is probably going to play a little bit more now that some of these tertiary wide receivers are out. Just a lot of the names that we're used to seeing on this offense. So when we go over here to the fantasy player tab, talk through this offense. I mean, first off, Richie James Jr., Kenny Golladay, going to be well worth the price tag. I would say that Richie James Jr., based on the target share that we've seen, is the guy that you probably want to get to. You know, he saw 5 targets, 6 targets, and 6 targets, whereas Golladay has still seen targets, just hasn't been productive, right? Was 0 for 3 last week. 0 for 0. Didn't see anything there in week 2, and then was just 2 for 2 for 22 yards in week 1. So he's not only seeing less targets than Richie James Jr., but also being less efficient with them. You've seen touchdown production for Richie James Jr., which you love to see over the first few weeks. Actually, I shouldn't say that. No touchdown production for Richie James Jr., but at least red zone targets, which is what we're looking for out of the fella. Let's go over to the other side. We've got the Bears. The Bears, last week, David Montgomery absolutely screwed like a quarter of the field. I mean, he was your mega chalk at running back. Khalil Herbert is a solid value at $5,700. I mean, you saw last week the sort of production that he's capable of. Posted 20 carries for nearly 160 yards. Also got a few targets out of the backfield. The issue I have here is that Khalil Herbert is almost going to be mega chalk. So when I look at his ownership here at 5,700, I have him at 6% right now. And that wasn't even accounting for David Montgomery being out. I still had him as questionable in my player pool. When I run my next sim of ownership here in the next few hours, I would imagine that somebody like Khalil Herbert goes from right around 6% ownership to maybe closer to like 20 to 25%. In fact, he might be one of the highest owned players on the entire slate. So keep that in mind with Khalil Herbert, right? That news that came out is going to drastically impact the ownership numbers that you see on him. At wide receiver, perhaps you get to Darnell Mooney now. So $5,000, he always has that long play upside in him. To this point, you haven't seen him really do anything. So the price tag has just gone down. Right now, he's at $5,000 rather than $5,700 where he started the year. And in week 1, you had people arguing that he was too cheap. Now he's $5,000, right? He's had a really rough go of it. But if you're looking at the long-term perspective, looking for a little bit of upside, he definitely has that in bunches, particularly because of the rapport he has with a Justin Fields. I mean, you saw it last year, right? He was by far the most in-tune wide receiver with Justin Fields, the only one that was really catching anything downfield. So I do like him in this matchup. And then, like I said, some of the value options for the Giants make sense, like a Richie James Jr. Even going to Bellinger at tight end is something that I could get behind because you saw last week the type of production to expect from him. Was returning from injury, so he didn't play much in week 1. Week 2 was still getting incorporated into the offense. But last time out in primetime, got 5 targets for 4 catches. That's the sort of thing that we can expect going forward. So Bellinger at $2,800. Perhaps another name to keep an eye on. Next up, we've got Jacksonville and the Philadelphia Eagles, the undefeated Philadelphia Eagles, for anybody out there that wasn't paying attention, but the last undefeated team in the NFL, and they're a powerhouse. I do have to say, I wasn't so sure about it. I thought that they had some upside, but at this point, I mean, the passing offense looks like one of the best in the NFL, which I can say is extremely surprising. I was not expecting to see that. And their defense has always been really good, right? So they went from essentially one of the worst passing offenses to one of the best. And they retained everything else about their team that made them special, which was a defense that was top 10 in the NFL, a rushing offense that was extremely efficient and still is efficient because of how much the passing offense is now distracting teams from the rushing offense. Just a ton of upside, and I expect them to have a really good year. So they might be undefeated for another like 3 to 4 weeks. Jacksonville has been solid on their own, but I do think they're playing above their head. They're 2-1, went from one of the worst teams in the NFL to now a winning team after the first 3 weeks. So the 6.5 point spread, I tend to agree with here. But if you want to get a little bit different, right, try to find a really low owned stack here. Trevor Lawrence is 2.2% owned. He's not getting any attention out there. He still projects for nearly 18 fantasy points. On the flip side, Jalen Hurts is above 10% in terms of his ownership. And though he's the second highest projected quarterback on the slate, he's expensive. You're paying $8,200 for it. Now, with that being said, I still love Jalen Hurts this week because at that price tag, he's got wide receivers that open up enough salary room for you. Right? You can get to Devonta Smith. He's only $5,800. I mean, he can be your third most expensive wide receiver. And then Goddard is only $4,500. That is more than affordable. Something that I'm definitely willing to get to. In fact, tied for the cheapest that he's been all year at this point. So, there's enough value to go around, particularly at a few of the other positions. I mean, Khalil Herbert now, right? He's a cheap running back that you can get to. We talked about a few other wide receivers, particularly for the Giants, that you can get to that are extremely cheap. You're not going to have a problem finding salary this week. So, getting to a Jalen Hurts, I think it's more than doable. He would be the side that I prefer in terms of buybacks. So the guys that I'm taking back there, it would probably be a wide receiver like a Christian Kirk. I considered taking a Marvin Jones Jr., even a Zay Jones as well. I'd probably scattershot it, right? It's kind of hard to tell who's going to have the best game out there. To this point, Christian Kirk, right? I should call him not Chris Kirk, right? I'm not his best buddy, right? I don't know him like that. Can't be calling him Chris out there. But Christian Kirk has been the guy to this point of the year, but I do think it'll be volatile. Marvin Jones Jr. hasn't really had his time to shine at this point. Last week, his touchdown and 13 fantasy points was the best that he's done. But I do think you're going to see some 20 to 25 point games out of him at some point. So somebody I want to invest in, try and get him early at low ownership because he is the lowest owned of the bunch. You have relatively high ownership on Kirk, also Zay Jones. If he plays, I think he'll get quite a bit of ownership. So if you're looking for a pivot, I think that guy is Marvin Jones Jr. Let's move on to the next game. We've got the Jets at my Pittsburgh Steelers. Boy, oh boy. If the Steelers can't win against the Jets, I do think it's time for Pickett to play. If they can't beat this sorry-ass Jets team, you're going to see a huge uproar in Pittsburgh. And I think even Mike Tomlin probably going to get very annoyed by it. But with that being said, everyone wants to play the Steelers now because it's a relatively competitive game. You haven't really been able to play the Steelers yet because of all of their inefficiencies out there. So when I go ahead and look at the ownership numbers, it doesn't thrill me that first off, Mitch Trubisky is 5.3% owned. And then when I look at the defensive ownership, somebody like the Steelers defense is 7.5% owned, which at that position is the highest owned defense in all of the entire slate. So clearly there's a positive sentiment behind this team, which I frankly don't understand. They've looked like complete and utter dog shit on offense throughout the entire year. So on the Steelers side, it's a complete fade for me. I don't care if they're playing the Jets, who can be the worst team in the entire NFL. Frankly, it wouldn't surprise me if the Steelers lost to the Jets. So you know what I'm doing? I am playing a Jet stack this week, and I am not kidding about that. I'm going to be playing Zach Wilson, who will be playing quarterback for the Jets for the first time this year. If you guys didn't know, he was named the starting quarterback and will be out there. He's $5,200. Apparently, him and Elijah Moore are kind of like a little bit of a power couple. So if you're looking for a stacking option, I think that him at $4,800 makes quite a bit of sense. You can get to Garrett Wilson, who's been productive. You can even take a Corey Davis, who's only $4,500. Much like the Jared Goff stack that I was talking about before, you start with these three players and you can pretty much take whoever the heck you want with the rest of your lineup, right? In terms of a buyback option, I think it has to be Deontay Johnson just because he dominates the target share at wide receiver, is going to get you a bunch of PPR production. This sort of stack right here that we've built over here to the right, I really don't hate the upside, particularly if Zach Wilson can get us some rushing production, get in there, score a rushing touchdown and that sort of thing. I don't know. I don't have that much faith in the Steelers, to be quite frank with you. Whenever they play a team like the Jets that are perceived to be one of the worst in the NFL, that's usually when Pittsburgh, even at home, they're completely viable to go out and do this, will usually lay an egg. They'll play down to their competition. I remember the Raiders when they won like one game about like 7 or 8 years ago. Their one win was against the Steelers. It happens all the time. And I believe that was with Terrell Pryor as their quarterback, who ran for like an 80-yard touchdown. It was an ESPN highlight. I'm sure you guys have seen the play before where he runs for like an 80-yard touchdown against the Steelers. Yeah. If that kind of stuff can happen to us, pretty much anything can. Let's move on to the next game now. I'm done talking about the Steelers. If you can't tell, I don't think it's going to be a particularly solid week for us. Let's talk about this Arizona and Panthers game now. So a lower total than I would have expected. And I think that's why the ownership numbers are as low as they are. So when we look at Kyler Murray, he's 1.7% owned. When we look at somebody like Baker Mayfield, who's only $5,200, going against an Arizona defense that has been one of the worst against passing offenses in all of the NFL, he's 4.4% owned. So this is a game that I really like getting to as a sneaky stack, because if CMC plays, you have plenty of star power from the Panthers to use as a buyback or to use in stacks. Then on the flip side, you have a ton of injuries for the Cardinals. We know that there's really going to be a concentrated offense. Guys like a Zach Ertz at 4% ownership are going to get plenty of targets. Guys like a Greg Dortch at wide receiver. If Marquise Brown is able to play, which he's expected to, right? He had a late injury designation, so he's probably going to play at $6,900. You use a Kyler Murray, Marquise Brown, and Zach Ertz stack, and let's see, what is it? 1.7% owned at quarterback. Then you have a 5% owned wide receiver and a 6% owned tight end. You're, multiplicative ownership there, right? It's just going to be super low. You're going to be duplicating yourself with like 0.4% of the field after taking your main stack, let alone if you differentiate with your buyback, right? You don't have to. You can take a CMC. Even at that point, you're still dealing with a small percentage of the field that you're playing with. So I love getting to those sort of lineups. I mean, they just make the most sense to me when I'm going with my builds. I don't love stacking Baker Mayfield. I mentioned him because he was relatively low owned, but I definitely prefer the Kyler Murray side. In terms of buybacks, you have CMC. We talked him up. You can get to DJ Moore. He's still way too cheap at $5,300. But outside of that, that's probably where I'd hold it off, right? I'd probably stick to CMC and a DJ Moore as the buyback, and players to stack with Kyler Murray. You have Greg Dortch. You have Rondale Moore if he plays. You can go to tight ends. Zach Ertz is a clear option there. Potentially, Trey McBride hasn't played so far this year, but everyone's talking him up like he's going to be like the next Rob Gronkowski or something like that. So hopefully later in the year, we're able to play a Trey McBride. He ends up getting the type of production that we're looking for. As of right now, I would avoid him, right? He hasn't seen like anything over the first 3 weeks, but maybe later on in the year, or if Zach Ertz goes out there and gets injured. Let's move on to the New England and Green Bay Packers game. I see there is a question down there. Kason says, are you worried about the weather in the Baltimore versus the Bills game? It might be an issue, right? So I don't love the game in general. I talked about how I think it's going to be super popular. And if we get to Saturday and Sunday and the weather is also an issue, it's just another reason to fade the game, right? So for me, I'm trying to target some of like the one-off spots that might be lower owned. But on the Bills side, you're talking about maybe the guys like Gabe Davis being a little bit overlooked. Dawson Knox, if he plays, might be a little bit lower owned. But for the Baltimore side, like it's just not a lot of guys that I like getting to anyways. So I hope there's injury concerns. Actually, not injury concerns. I hope there's weather concerns, because if so, it's going to make it an even harder circumstance for guys to go out there, score 30, 40 fantasy points, and might make it even worse piece of chalk to get to. So great question there, Kason. I'll have to keep an eye on it as the week goes on. But yeah, that's something that I'm going to keep an eye on now. I actually didn't know about the weather concerns there. But if there's going to be weather concerns, even more reason to fade it. Let's talk about the New England versus Packers game. Bring it up over here on ESPN. Obviously, the huge storyline here is no Mac Jones. Going to have Brendan Hoyer at quarterback. On the other side, you have a struggling Green Bay passing attack, which has been wildly inconsistent to this point. They've had a few bright spots. Weeks 2 and 3 were a lot better than week 1, that's for sure, for Aaron Rodgers. But he hasn't been in nearly the form that he's looking for. And we know that Hoyer is going to struggle in his first time out too. So it's a 40-point over-under. I tend to agree with that. I don't think it's the best game from a fantasy point perspective. But if you're going to get to anybody here, maybe it's the running backs, right? So if we go ahead and just look at the running back position by team, the 2 expensive ones are over there on Green Bay. If I had to prefer one, it would probably be Aaron Jones, just because of the receiving upside that we've seen to this point. Take a look at it, right? Last week, 4 targets, 3 and 5 targets. He's also seen plenty of rushing attempts. So he's getting the ball in his hands 15 to 18 times, and he's arguably one of the most productive players in the NFL per touch. 8.8 yards a carry, 9.8 yards a carry. Wasn't as productive in week 3, obviously. That's what we've seen over the first 2 weeks. But I expect him to get back to that sort of mold, maybe post a 35-point performance. like what he was able to do against that Chicago Bears team in prime time. So I like him at the running back position. Ramondre Stevenson is always my low-owned play I love getting to. Guys, last week I played him at like 1% ownership. He was also only $4,800, and he got us 20 fantasy points. Now, he did luck sack a touchdown towards the end of the game, which obviously helped us out immensely, but he got 5 targets out of the backfield, which he converted for 4 catches, still saw 12 attempts for over 6 yards a carry. He's going to dominate the backfield here at some point. The reason why I'm playing him early and often is he's by far the better running back in that backfield, and I'm betting on it happening, right? Bill Belichick, when he sees how much more productive Stevenson is going to start to make him the bell cow back. And if we know one thing about the Patriots is that their bell cow backs are capable of posting nuclear games. If you remember a few years ago, I can't even remember the guy's name. He posted like a 40-point fantasy point performance out of nowhere in like week 16 or 17 of the NFL season. He hadn't played the entire year, then all of a sudden got like 200 yards and 4 touchdowns. Someone go ahead and remind me if you can remember that guy's name, but he was on the Patriots. It wasn't that long ago. That sort of thing happens all the time with the Patriots. So, Stevenson, I think he's the better talent out of that backfield. So he's the player that I'm looking to get to. He's a little bit more expensive now. So, right, he's creeping up closer to Damian Harris in terms of ownership. But I think that he is deservingly the higher owned player. Let's talk about a few Green Bay Packers. So at wide receiver, they do have Christian Watson back, but Romeo Doubs is clearly the guy that you want to get to here. I'd argue that he should be higher priced than Allen Lazard. So when you look at the targets, you can see last week Doubs had 8 targets. He had 5 and 3 over the first 2 weeks. Lazard last week was still getting targets, but only 6, right? He only had 3 targets there in week 2. So Doubs is starting to get more attention from Aaron Rodgers and reportedly has a great relationship with him, right? You've seen all of these interviews where Aaron Rodgers is just talking up Romeo. So somebody that I like getting to at $4,500, I think he's going to be closer to $5,500 for the rest of the year. So it's a good buy low spot. Robert Tonyan at tight end, he's only $3,500. I also think that he's somebody worth taking. And yes, you're 100% right there, CJ. It's Jonas Gray. And the thing is, you can't remember that name. At least I can't. And I'm a huge hardcore football fan. That's how much of a nobody he was, right? And you remember Jonas Gray, I think he fumbled 2 games later, and it might even have been in a playoff game at that point, and he never saw the field again. It was like he was banished to Siberia after he went out there and he fumbled the ball for Bill Belichick. It's an interesting offense. That's all I'm going to say, is that he is not afraid to ride the hot hand. And I believe before that, it wasn't even injury concern based. He went away from their starting running back just because he thought that Gray looked good that week. So if Stevenson looks really good in practice this week, maybe he gets that sort of run. So I definitely like getting to him there. The last game we'll talk about is going to be the Broncos at the Raiders game. I think this might be one to keep an eye on, at least in terms of ownership. Derek Carr in that offense is getting stacked quite a bit. So it's not going to be the low-end offense that you're looking for. But at least as of my early ownership projections, Russell Wilson in that Broncos offense is being completely overlooked. So in terms of your ownership, I have him at 2.1% right now. Guys like a Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton are also being overlooked. So Cortland Sutton only 10% ownership. Jerry Jeudy is only 6.7% owned. So if you're looking for the lower owned side of the game, it would be the Broncos. And, it's only a 3-point spread. And, they are the underdogs here. I like Russell Wilson playing from behind, right? He's going to have to go out there, force the ball downfield. As like a Cortland Sutton should see a higher ADOT in the game that they're playing from behind. And even though it's only a 45-point over-under, I think I might be playing some Russell Wilson stacks this week. And I know he's been extremely inefficient to this point, but it's still Russell Wilson. He's a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. For as cringe as he is, for some of the stupid stuff that he posts on social media that drives me crazy, he's still a top-end player. So I have to put credit where it's due. I think that he's worth a few options, or at least a few looks, in terms of stacking options when it comes to your GPP pool. In terms of Derek Carr, like I mentioned, he is relatively high owned. So Derek Carr at this point is 7.1% owned. They're at $5,800. A few of the stacking options like a Devontae Adams are 8.9% owned. So actually, that's pretty reasonable to me, right? Obviously, not nearly as much attention is going to Devontae because most of it is going to Stephon Diggs, who's only $100 more expensive and is nearly 3 times the ownership. If you're going to take a Derek Carr stack, I would argue just use Devontae Adams, right? Because he's giving you a little bit of ownership leverage right there. Hunter Renfrow is out, which is only going to put even more targets into Devontae Adams' hands. Darren Waller at $5,600, you could probably make that stack work. So just to give you an idea, it's a little bit more chalky. I do prefer the Russell Wilson side, but you could start here, take Derek Carr, take Devontae Adams, and put Darren Waller in the lineup and still be perfectly fine with the rest of your build, right? You're still at $5,000 remaining per player. You can take a premium running back or a premium wide receiver and still not be taking value at every position. So I do like that stack. A buyback, Cortland Sutton makes sense. You could go to Javonte Williams there at running back too. I think he's more than an adequate buyback. But if you're doing a Russell Wilson stack, just to give you an idea of that, what that would look like, right? Let's take Russell Wilson. Let's go ahead and put Jerry Jeudy in this one. Albert O at tight end is a good little 3-man stack to go with for the Broncos. The buyback here, you can be a little bit more creative, right? So a lot of people would probably go in and just click Devontae Adams, but you can go down here and take Josh Jacobs, who's gotten plenty of touches over the last few weeks. I like this game in general. The more and more I'm looking at it, especially a lot of the names involved, I think it's being underrated and underutilized. I mean, even this Derek Carr stack where it's nearly like 7-8% owned, he probably should be chalk on this slate. And I know, 7-8% is a lot higher than some of his peers, right? Just to give you some perspective there, right? So 7.1% on somebody like a Derek Carr is way higher than a Jared Goff. It's 4 times higher than a Trevor Lawrence. It's getting up there with somebody like a Marcus Mariota. But if it's staying around that level, it doesn't get anything crazy throughout the weekend, is probably something that I'm investing in. So that's what I have to say about that game. Let's go over to Prize Picks and wrap this thing up now. So we'll go ahead and talk through some of the boards, the passing guard props, just in general, guys. This is a fade board in general. These have been mostly hitting under for the entire year. There's going to be scattered instances where you're going to want to take the over on some of the props here. Just not my favorite board to go with in general. So I'm going to go ahead and skip that one here. In terms of your rushing yard props, there were a few that I had my eye on for Thursday Night Football that got bumped before lock. And I'm going to try and beat a few of them here for the Sunday night slate. So let's go ahead and talk through some of those. So I'll give you an idea. Towards the bottom of the board, where is the Rashad Penny prop? I'm going to search them up here because it's easier than going through the entire list of like a million different props. So they have Rashad Penny, a few of the props on here. I had the 57.5 rushing yards, but I saw a few people on Twitter also taking the fantasy score prop. I don't hate that. The reason why I'm taking this rushing yard prop here is that first off, last week he got there, right? Got you to the 66 yards. But look at the end of the run last season. Like when they were playing pretty solid there, got into that playoff run towards the end, he was posting a ton of yardage for that team. He's somebody who, when they're running well, it's supposed to be a 1-point spread, right? Them in that game. Well, actually, it wasn't. It's not a 1-point spread. It's a little bit closer. It's not 1 point, though. I think it might have been like a 3.5 point. Yeah, 3.5 point spread between those two teams. He's still going to get plenty of production, even if they're playing from behind, right? They're not expected to lose by 7 to 14 points. 3.5 point spread, right? A little bit more reasonable. I think that he gets to the 57.5 all day. So that was one of the first props that I bet all week. Another prop that I was considering here, get it off the screen there, boys, my bad, was Devontae Adams. So Devontae Adams, his receiving yard prop, is at 76.5. I saw a few sports books that had him closer to 79.5 in terms of the over-under. Now, some of those were bumped down closer to 77.5, 76.5. So some of the action has taken it back down towards where they have it at Prize Picks now. But I would be taking the over here all day. Also the over on his fantasy score. Without Hunter Renfrow, he's going to be getting a ton of the targets there out of the backfield. And not out of the backfield, sorry, out of the slot there for the Raiders. And clearly has a rapport with Derek Carr, who he played with in college. So I expect him to have a huge day in that high-scoring competitive game against the Broncos. A few other props I had my eye on were actually with interceptions. I'm the interception guy when it comes to taking a few of these. When I'm looking for the interception props, I'm looking for not only a quarterback that is inefficient, and that's going to throw interceptions, but also a game where you're expecting a lot of passing attempts. And when I look at a lot of the game scripts here, I mean, first off, Mitch Trubisky against the Jets, that's probably a decent spot to attack. But the spots I really like getting to are like a Kirk Cousins at the New Orleans Saints. First off, the Saints have a ball-hawking secondary, but then with Kirk Cousins, you have a team that loves throwing the ball and loves throwing it down the field. So they're not going to be at a shortage of going out there and attempting to throw the ball. And though he can be a little bit efficient, right? So he's a lot more efficient. Don't get me wrong. than somebody like a Cooper Rush, than a Mitchell Trubisky, that's for sure. A lot more efficient than somebody, let's say, like a Baker Mayfield. But he's going to throw the ball, I don't know, 1.5, maybe twice as much as some of those quarterbacks, particularly if he's in a competitive game against the Saints. Those are the type of situations that I like to attack. I also consider Justin Herbert. I mean, they throw the ball a ton over there, so we know that he's going to have plenty of opportunity to throw a pick. Was able to hit that against Kansas City, which was nice for us. Also threw one against Jacksonville for us last week. And those were the only two I bet, but I consider taking the Derek Carr one. I consider taking Mitch Trubisky, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. The interception props in general almost always project for the over. So if you're looking to, lean on the board one way or the other, it would definitely be an over there. And then go over to fantasy score. There were a few that I was considering. So first and foremost, the Russell Wilson over for his fantasy score is only at 17 fantasy score. They're clearly reacting to some of what we've seen over the first 3 weeks. He's a better quarterback than that. Definitely somebody I was considering the over for. And then I had Lamar Jackson over on his fantasy score. So his fantasy score is at 22 at this point. I mean, he's averaging nearly 100 yards rushing. You can see they have his passing yard prop at 22.5, his rushing yard prop at over 50 yards. So just, kind of encapsulating all of it, just take the over on fantasy score, because I'm expecting him to have a huge day in some capacity against the Bills, whether it's rushing, whether it's passing through the air. It's just hard to predict, right? Because he brings both of those assets to the table. So I think the best way to attack it and not get screwed by him just going out there and being a little bit more rushing heavy, or him going out there and screwing us by being passing heavy when we bet on some of the rushing props, is just to take his fantasy score. And that's what I like to say about some of the quarterbacks here, especially the ones that bring rushing upside to the table, is that's usually the way that I like to go. That's also why with Kyler Murray, for example, another player that I think is being underpriced because he's being completely shit on for his start of the year, right? Like, they haven't had the best start to this point, but he brings plenty of rushing upside to the table. And at 19 fantasy score is another player that I'd like taking the over on. But that is all I've got for this preview, guys. I've got another stream to do at 9 to prepare for, so I've got to hop on out of here and get that done. But we will have even more content throughout the weekend. I'm going to try and put out a few videos for the main slate from a strategy perspective, so keep an eye out for that. We'll be doing a Monday night video. We'll be doing a stream probably right around 6 p.m. Eastern time on Monday. I'm talking through that single game slate. And then, of course, for week 5, we'll have next week's slate of content there too. So make sure you are subscribed to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss any of that in the future. Before you hop on out of here, go ahead and smash that like button, and best of luck with all of your lineups for this week, fellas.